Thanks, Brenton. It's Phil. Just going to defog my glasses a little. I'm going to have to give up those dreams of being a surgeon now. I don't think I can handle wearing a mask. It's uncertain times that we live in, isn't it? And I felt this morning was a good time just to perhaps uncomplicate things a little and just reflect on a couple of things in our lives and how they've, I suppose, given us some, it's a little bit wobbly, how they've given us some certainty and comfort over the last year or two. So a couple of years ago, Leela and I and our daughters decided that we were going to become foster parents, and we were going to foster children because we thought it was something that we might be able to do. We thought we hadn't messed up the first ones too bad, so maybe we couldn't go too bad with helping others in need. And so on 3rd of January last year, our lives changed when a tiny little 2-week-old bundle arrived at our door, and this was Angel, or Annie as she became to be known. She was just over 2 kilos when she came to us. She was literally skin and bones. I can tell you it was a pretty emotional time. We were awestruck with just how tiny and fragile she was, and we handled her carefully, as if even our very breath could break her. And so she became part of our family, and we toiled through broken nights of sleep, remembering again just how exhausting a baby could be. And even though I was on the right side of 50, I think I felt closer to 60. Apologies to all those 6-year-olds out there. We worked hard as a family to make sure that all her needs were met, adjusting her formula so that more stayed down than came up, and slowly inching towards that first night when she would sleep through. And of course it was complicated because as a foster child she continued to have access with her birth parents. And that wasn't easy for her, even as a tiny baby, something which surprised me, I have to say. And as she fell into a routine with our home, it was then broken by the hours of care that she'd have with her birth parents. And to be clear, within the foster system, we support reconciliation where it's in the best interest of the child, but it's never easy. And in fact, that's underselling it. It's terribly hard, particularly on the child. And so it was with Annie, who, even at such a tender age, started to exhibit signs of trauma following each access visit. So it was almost some relief, I guess, when COVID arrived and swept away access. Little did we know how big an impact it would go on to have, but at that stage, it removed that trauma from Annie's life. And I can tell you that when life for a child is hard in care, life for the carer becomes, I guess, challenging is a good way to put it. Now, one of the comments that people often make to us is they couldn't consider fostering themselves because they wouldn't be able to give the child back. And to be fair, it's only an issue if you've opened your heart to the child. Surely that's what the child deserves, and I think that's what people are saying to us. They don't know how they would be able to manage that. And so the price we pay for having this poor, defenceless and innocent child in our home is a piece of our hearts. It's a price that we have to be prepared to pay. And so we find ourselves in this tug of war as we struggle to justify the emotional cost with the challenges which she also brings with her. It's a very one-sided equation and it doesn't seem very fair at times. But we don't have any alternative because our little angel, Annie, well, that's just what's fair and right for her. And as time has gone on, we're grateful to see her develop, to grow her personality, and so that we can learn the person that she is and get to know her. And she has a very big personality when she feels safe. When she doesn't, when she's insecure, she hides behind us. She has a beautiful smile which tries to deflect potential danger. So often strangers comment to us how beautiful her smile is, not realising that often she's not smiling at them, but she's trying to placate them in some way so that they won't hurt her. It's a defence, not a welcome. We've learned to read her moods, and we're teaching her how to manage them, how to communicate, how to ensure that we understand what her needs are, what she's trying to tell us. Now we can anticipate some situations, I guess, where we know it will be easier for her to manage than others, all the while helping her to grow some resilience. I guess we know her better than anybody now, and more importantly, she knows us. As time's gone on, we've been steadily asked and encouraged to consider her staying with us long term, and truth be told, there was never a question that needed to be asked. We always anticipated that this would be the case. And so everything we do and everything we've done is on the basis that Annie can have that stability and certainty, and that she can feel that this never wavers at all. At the end of the day, she has to have absolute confidence in us and our love for her. And that's exactly as it is. She is our child in the same way as Taylor and Emma, and Alex and Mo, Dassie, Matty, Harva and Nani are. And more recently, Mrs. joined the crew as well, who arrived 8 weeks ago. We love them all just the same. And if anybody suggested that Annie or Missy were any less our children than any of the others, I think we'd have a very robust conversation indeed. So what's that got to do with leading our thoughts to the bread and the wine this morning? I guess it's because for many years I've tried to come to terms with our relationship with God. I struggle with it because it's intangible. You can't see it. It's very difficult to understand the health of it, if you like. We struggle to have a two-way conversation, and the communication with us from God most directly through the Bible is potentially open to all sorts of interpretation. So part of the problem we have is that we have a wonderful way of complicating things as humans, don't we? We can take the most simple of things, and our curiosity will lead us to examine and test our thoughts, our understanding, our hypotheses, to ensure that we're absolutely right. We look at fields of knowledge from different perspectives and through different lenses, and sometimes this leads to extraordinary breakthroughs. The microwave oven was not discovered because somebody was trying to find a quick way to cook food. It was somebody studying something quite different and noticed that a chocolate bar in their pocket had melted. And the pacemaker came about because an engineer who was trying to record the sounds that the heart makes made a mistake with the equipment he was using and discovered a device which was giving off an electrical pulse instead. I remember at university spending a very confusing period of time studying pure maths, which I understood was meant to be looking at how the basics of maths work, but it didn't seem very basic to me. This morning, I want to strip back some of those layers of complexity and sophistication that we often add when we're trying to make sense of our relationship with God, and return to the most basic foundation. And I think, in one word, that has to be confidence. You see, in the past I've talked about my understanding of our relationship with God as one of his children by reflecting on the relationship I have with my own children. And that served me well. But with the arrival of Annie and now Missy, well, I think there's a greater appreciation of how that relationship works. And if you can't see it in your own relationship with God, then look at how Annie interacts with us and perhaps consider this to be some parable of what exists between you and God. And that's not meant to sound arrogant in any way. It's let me put it to you like this. If you asked any parent in this church, in this family, about their children, it will be evident that they love them. Sure, there might be times when they're frustrated with them. There might be times when they're particularly proud of them. There might be times when they don't necessarily like them. But unswervingly, you will find that they love them. And you know, as a parent, when it's your own flesh and blood, that's what happens. You love them, however good or bad things are. So when we came to fostering, I didn't know how this was going to work. And I have to admit, I've been surprised at my capacity to love Annie. I mean, I knew that I wanted to, but could I? Would it be the same? Because we don't have any connection to her other than that we offered to give a child a home. But I can tell you that we will fight for her, and we are fiercely protective of her, and we're constantly watching out for her. In every aspect of our relationship with her, there is no difference to any of our biological children. And isn't that what our relationship with God is? Because none of us are his biological children, so to speak. He had one son, Jesus. And yet we are all treated exactly the same, with the same love and care extended to us as to his own son. Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 5 and 6, and just bring this up and read it for you. It tells us this, that in love he predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will and to the praise of his glorious grace with which he has blessed us in the beloved. We're adopted children of God, and Jesus is our brother. That's our relationship. That's where our relationship starts with God. The thing is that children are not perfect. And putting aside the teething or the colds or the things like that which make life difficult, even at such a tender age, Annie deals with trauma, which stems from her life before she became part of our family. And there could be any number of reasons for this, but it's something that we have to work through with her, and which will teach her to manage herself in the future. But right now it's just like the rubbish that we bring with us from our lives before we became children of God. As Paul calls it, the sin which so easily besets us, which has a habit of showing time and again. And when we recognise it in our lives, it distresses us as we try to deal with it. I love Paul's writings in Romans 7 when he talks about the struggle that he has with sin. And at verse 22 he says that I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law, waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am. You know, I've often felt this way as a child of God, but I never had any appreciation of how God might view this as our Father. So when I see Annie struggling to deal with these problems, which aren't of any of our doing, they're things which have come into her life now, which we need to help her with, well, my heart breaks for her, because she's so ill-equipped emotionally for the task. And so I have love and pity and empathy and patience, and I'm there to help her overcome these issues in any way possible. So given that God has adopted us as his own children, knowing our weaknesses and our failings and the things that have happened in our lives in the past, why would we think that he views us any differently? So often we speak with shame of our struggle with sin and our fear of the consequences of failing, but I don't think that's what we should be doing. If there is a struggle, that's not shameful. That's evidence of someone trying to do what God wants, and God is there as our parent, willing us on. In Hebrews 4, it's put like this, verse 15 and 16. We don't have a high priest who is unable to sympathise with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help him in time of need. See, when we are struggling, that's when we can be confident of God's love for us. Because as we know, God's strength is made perfect in weakness. And let's be quite clear with that. That's a statement of fact. It's not a question. When Annie is struggling with her trauma, we support her 100%. And it's exactly the same with God. When we are struggling with sin, he is supporting us every step of the way. It reminds me of the footprints in the sand story, where the man is looking back over his life with God as two sets of footprints, and he asks God why sometimes there's only one set, and God replies, well, there's only one set because that's where I carried you. That long groove over there, that's where I dragged you along for a little while. Sometimes it feels like we're being dragged along, doesn't it? And that's okay. We're still moving with God. Sometimes as a parent, you feel like you're the one doing the dragging. I read some comments the other day by another foster carer who talked about the impacts of trauma on children. In particular, those who had suffered from in utero drug abuse. And she talked about the challenges that they would face for years to come. It doesn't just stop when the alcohol or the drugs are out of their system. The physiological impacts on the developing brains stay there. She talked about parenting situations where the child can't do something, not won't do it. There's a difference. She talked about parenting an emotional age, not a chronological age. And I think that fits very neatly with Paul's description of our struggle with sin in Romans 7, because the good that he wants to do, he doesn't do, and the sin he doesn't want to, well, that's what he does. I sometimes think it's the same thing with us when we're struggling. There's a difference between can't and won't. Sometimes the struggle is too much. And sometimes I wonder whether we see people and we consider their chronological age rather than as being reflective of their spiritual age. And perhaps sometimes that's not always the case. Perhaps sometimes we've got issues that we're trying to deal with and our spiritual age has been affected by that. So let's be kind to one another when we're talking to one another. I see a lot of parallels here between our relationship as parents of Annie and our relationship as children of God. The key, as I said, which underpins this is confidence. As the adults in the room, Annie has to be able to have confidence in us. So that's why she runs with outstretched arms to us, knowing with absolute certainty that we'll pick her up when she runs to us. That's why when she wakes in the middle of the night and she calls for us, that she knows that we will come to her. It's interesting, the leader who always seems to wake first tells me that she calls out Daddy more than Mummy. I once felt that this fed my vanity a little bit. I suspect that Lita might be fudging the dart a little bit there. Either way, when Annie calls, off we trot. That's the confidence that she has in us. She believes that we are the answer to all her problems. One of my favourite Bible verses, thanks to Cliff York, who first demonstrated this to me, is Isaiah 59, verse 1. It's one of those verses you have to act out to understand it. And it says in verse 1, "Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save." So one of the things I just want to do is just reach out your hands and just stretch them out. And then consider how you shorten them. And you shorten them by pulling your fingers in and you make fists. This is not what God does for us. He doesn't present us with fists, but he presents us with his outstretched hands. The way you save people is by reaching out and grabbing hold of somebody. Perhaps the best imagery I can think of here is when Peter was walking on the water, and as he sank into the cold depths of the water, he said, "Save me." And the scripture records that immediately Jesus was there, reaching out his hand to save him. That's the confidence that we have in God, that his hands are constantly outstretched to save us. And this is how Jesus could have confidence in God when he came to the cross. And in the Garden of Gethsemane beforehand, he could pray, "Not my will, but yours be done." I want to bring our thoughts to the bread and the wine this morning through the reading that we had. And I want us to find ourselves in the reading first of all. And we're right up front in Luke 15. I think if you can place yourself in the reading, it makes things so much more real for us. So it starts off, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him." Well, that's us then, isn't it? What does Jesus have to say to us? He tells us parables of the rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents. And again, that's us, isn't it? Bringing joy to heaven. And the first two parables are fairly brief. I want to consider briefly the third parable of the prodigal son. When he tells this, I feel a tug in my heart. You know, there's so much to this story, I wonder whether Jesus based this on a situation that he was familiar with in some way. Perhaps a friend or an acquaintance of the family had a similar circumstance, and Jesus adapted this to teach us a lesson. And we know the story, don't we, how the younger son takes his inheritance and goes and squanders it on easy living. He had confidence in his own resources. And then when those were gone, well, that's okay. He's confident he can still get by and earn a living, but he's robbed of that opportunity when the famine arises. This all speaks of that trauma which goes on in our life before we accept Jesus into our lives and become one of God's children. And there's this moment of self-realisation when he's hit absolute rock bottom and his self-confidence evaporates and he can no longer support himself. And that's when he remembers the confidence that he can have in his own father. And he realises that this is not dependent on whether he's even his son or not. If we read there from verse 17, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against you, against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son." Why did Jesus put that into the parable? Was it really necessary to teach us the lesson here? It really identifies our relationship with God, that we're not his children specifically. We're not worthy to be called his children, and yet that's the relationship that he calls us to have with him. And so the son is confident that his father will treat him well. Of course, Jesus goes on to tell us in the parable that far from this being the case, the father goes much further, springs into celebration mode because he's constantly been on the lookout for him. I think this is beautifully summed up in the first letter of John, chapter 4, verse 9 and 10, where it says, "And this is how the love of God is revealed to us. God has sent his only Son into the world so that we can live through him. And this is love. It's not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as a sacrifice that deals with our sins." This is love, that God loved us. The key part here isn't that we've come to our senses and now we love God, but that he loved us before we even knew about him and all that he had done for us. And having loved us, he has done all things for us. Why would we think that a God who did all things for us preemptively, before we even knew of his existence, would fail us in any way whatsoever now. The confidence we have in him, Jesus tells us in the parable, is that in spite of our waywardness, he's laid a feast for us to celebrate our return to him. So this morning we have a feast laid out for us, a spiritual meal which meets our needs more than any of us could possibly want. It fills our hearts with the love of God, and through Jesus' sacrifice we get to sit at the family table. We're not a guest, we're family, all treated just the same. And so here we sit, gathered together with Jesus, to eat this meal as we confidently approach the throne of grace.